craziest interrogation moments of all time. The room was cold, not just from the air, but from something deeper. A sterile, windowless box, walls painted a dull, lifeless gray. A single flickering bulb buzzed above, casting uneven shadows. Detective Harris sat across the table, eyes locked onto the man in front of him. A man who hadn't blinked in minutes. His name was Joel Carter. Thin, pale, eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks. His fingers drummed a slow, deliberate rhythm on the metal table. Tap, tap, tap. The detective slid a photograph forward. A gruesome crime scene. Joel tilted his head, smirked. "That's interesting," he muttered. His voice was dry, almost amused. Harris leaned forward. "Tell me what happened that night." Silence. Then Joel did something strange. He sniffed the air. Slow, deep, like he was savoring something. "I can still smell it," he whispered. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. The room felt smaller, tighter. Joel finally looked up, meeting the detective's gaze. His pupils were enormous. "I didn't kill her," he said, "but I was there when she changed." Harris felt his throat tighten. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster. Joel smiled, a wide, unsettling grin. Then he leaned forward and whispered, "She's still in here with us." The light flickered. The air turned heavy. And somewhere, just beyond the room's walls, a soft, wet breath echoed back. Harris froze. The sound was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. A breath. Wet. Uneven. Like something struggling to inhale. His fingers tensed around his holster. "Who's in here with us?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. Joel's grin widened. His teeth, too white, too sharp, flashed under the dim light. He tilted his head again, listening. Then, slowly, he reached for the detective's hand. Harris recoiled, standing up so fast his chair screeched across the floor. Joel laughed. Low, raspy. His fingers drummed the table again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of the breath grew louder. Near the corner of the room, Harris turned his head, pulse hammering. Nothing was there, just the gray wall, the metal door, and that flickering damn light. Joel leaned back, stretching his arms like a man waking from a nap. His voice dropped to a whisper. "She's watching you now." Harris swallowed hard. "You're playing games," he growled. "I don't scare that easily." Joel chuckled. "Oh, detective, you don't have to be scared." He looked up, straight at the buzzing light bulb. "She just likes it when you notice her." The light flickered again. Then, it went out. Pitch black. A second of total silence. Then, a whisper, right beside Harris's ear. "Low. Wet. Wrong." "Detective." The light snapped back on. Harris spun, reaching for his gun. But Joel was gone. The chair was empty. The cuffs that had chained him to the table, open. Still locked. Still intact. Just empty. Harris's heart slammed against his ribs. His radio crackled to life. A voice, shaky, on the other end. "Detective W, we have a problem." Harris swallowed hard, gripping the radio. "Go ahead." The officer hesitated. Then in a trembling voice he spoke. "The cameras, they show you sitting alone in that room." A pause. "You've been alone this entire time." Harris felt the blood drain from his face. His fingers clenched around the radio. Static crackled through the speaker. "Say that again," he whispered. The officer on the other end hesitated. "The footage is just you, sir." "No Joel. No handcuffs. No anything." Harris turned back to the table. The metal surface gleamed under the flickering light. Empty. No warmth. No fingerprints. Like no one had been there at all. His breath came fast, shallow. His mind raced. He had seen Joel. He had spoken to him. Hadn't he? A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He reached forward, hesitantly, placing his fingers on the cold steel. Then, a whisper. So close, it brushed against his skin. "You remember me now, don't you?" Harris spun, heart slamming into his ribs. Nothing. Just the room. Just the walls. Just the weight of something unseen pressing down on his chest. The door burst open. A uniformed officer stood there, panting. His face was pale. His hands trembled. "Sir," he gasped. Harris stared at him, still gripping the edge of the table. What? The officer swallowed hard. We just checked the records. He hesitated. Joel Carter died 6 years ago. The words hit like a punch to the gut. No, Harris said, shaking his head. That's not possible. But the officer was already stepping back, his face twisted in fear. And Harris realized something else. The breath against his ear. The whisper. The feeling of being watched. It hadn't stopped. It was still there, growing closer. Right behind him. Harris didn't turn around. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to run, to leave, to forget this ever happened. But he couldn't move. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. The air behind him felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting, watching. The officer at the door took a step back. His eyes widened in horror. Detective. Harris clenched his jaw. His grip on his holster tightened. Then, a hand touched his shoulder. Cold, clammy, not human. Harris whipped around, drawing his gun. But there was nothing there. Just empty space. Just silence. Just the slow, rhythmic tap of something unseen. Tap, 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 asterisk, asterisk. Coming from under the table. Harris's stomach twisted. The officer bolted. His footsteps echoed down the hall. Harris reached out with a shaking hand and slowly, painfully crouched down. The shadows under the table were deep. Too deep. The light above barely touched them. And then, a face stared back at him. Joel! Eyes black, mouth twisted into something inhuman. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Just air. Just that awful, wet breath. Harris scrambled back, heart hammering. The chair toppled over. The lights flickered, and Joel crawled out. His movements were wrong. Jerked. Twisted. Like a marionette with its strings cut. Then he stood. Too tall. Too thin. His smile stretched wider. Detective, he whispered. The room plunged into darkness. Harris felt something move inches from his face. And then, the last thing he heard before everything went silent. A whisper. Soft. Amused. You should have left when you had the chance. Harris couldn't breathe. The darkness swallowed him whole. His fingers fumbled for his gun. But his arms felt heavy. Too heavy. Like something was pressing down on him. A weight, cold and suffocating, wrapped around his chest. Then, a sharp, wet inhale, right next to his ear. He twisted, blindly reaching, but his hands met only air. The room felt endless now. The walls gone. The floor vanished. Only darkness. And the presence. Joel's voice slithered through the void. Low. Twisting. You feel it now, don't you? Harris squeezed his eyes shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then, a hand clamped around his wrist. Thin. Icy. Wrong. His eyes snapped open. Joel loomed over him. His face stretched. Distorted. His black eyes bore into Harris's soul. You let me in, he whispered. His grip tightened. Harris gasped. His skin burned where Joel touched him. Like ice and fire at the same time. He struggled, but his body wouldn't obey. Wouldn't move. Wouldn't. The walls slammed back into place. The light flooded the room. Harris fell backward, gasping for air. The chair, the table, the door, asterisk, asterisk back, asterisk, asterisk. The interrogation room, asterisk, asterisk, normal, asterisk, asterisk. Empty, silent. Joel was gone, but his voice, still there, still whispering, still crawling beneath Harris's skin. And then, Harris saw it. His reflection in the two-way mirror. And standing right behind him, Joel, grinning, waiting. Harris's breath hitched. His reflection stood frozen, wide-eyed with terror. But Joel, asterisk, asterisk, Joel moved, asterisk, asterisk. Not in the glass. Behind him, slowly, deliberately, a shadow stretching longer, darker, twisting into something inhuman. Harris couldn't turn. His body refused. His mind screamed, asterisk, asterisk, run, asterisk, asterisk. But he stood there, helpless, watching. Joel's grin widened in the reflection. His head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then, he lifted a single, bony finger and placed it over his lips. SHHHH. Harris's chest tightened. His throat locked up. The room grew smaller. Closer. Like the walls were folding in on him. Then, Joel leaned forward, pressing his lips close to Harris's ear. But in the reflection, he never moved. His voice slithered into Harris's mind like a sickness. "You'll see me again soon." A sharp, cold breath crawled down his neck. Harris gasped, and the lights flickered. Just once. And then, Joel was gone. No shadow. No reflection. No sound. Just an empty room. Just Harris. Standing there, heart hammering, hands trembling. But something felt different. Wrong. He swallowed hard and turned toward the two-way mirror. His reflection stared back. Still pale. Still shaken. But then, it blinked. A second too late. Like it wasn't his at all. Harris's stomach dropped. His pulse pounded in his ears. His reflection stood there, watching. Silent. Still. But something was off. The way it breathed. The way its chest rose, just a little too slowly. The way its lips twitched in amusement. Though Harris's never moved. Then, the reflection smiled. Harris didn't. His own face grinned back at him. Wide. Stretched. Wrong asterisk asterisk. The fluorescent light above buzzed violently. A hum that crawled under his skin. His fingers curled into fists. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. With a sharp breath, he forced himself to move. To step forward. To face whatever nightmare was staring back at him. His reflection did the same. A perfect copy. Until it stopped. Harris took another step. His reflection did not. His lungs seized. Cold sweat prickled down his spine. The grin on the glass grew wider. Lips parting. Slowly. Deliberately. And then, it spoke. Without sound. Without a voice. But Harris understood. He read the words forming on its lips. "You are not you anymore." The lights died. Total darkness. A whisper. Crawling through the void. Soft. Wet. Laughing. And then, a single, sharp breath. Inside his own lungs. But it wasn't his. Harris choked. His own breath felt foreign. Like something else was inside his chest. Moving. Stretching. Taking hold. His fingers twitched, jerking, unnatural. His knees buckled. The darkness pressed in. Then, the lights flashed back on. Harsh. Blinding. Harris gasped, stumbling backward. The room was the same. Silent. Empty. But the mirror was not. His reflection stood there. Still. Watching. Grinning. But Harris wasn't smiling. His own face wasn't his own. The reflection blinked. Slow. Deliberate. Then, it raised a hand. Harris's hand stayed at his sides. His reflection was moving on its own. A slow, careful motion, until its hand pressed against the glass. A single, pale fingerprint smudged onto the surface. Harris's stomach twisted. That smudge was on his side of the mirror. His chest tightened. His breath shook. And then, the reflection spoke again. This time, Harris heard it. Clear. Soft. "Let me in." A sharp, deafening crack. The mirror shattered. 1,000 splintered reflections of Joel's grin fell around him. And as the shards hit the floor, so did his own body. The last thing Harris saw, before everything went dark, was his reflection, standing inside the broken glass. Smiling. Free. Harris hit the ground hard. His body felt weightless. Detached. Like he was sinking into something cold, thick, asterisk, asterisk, endless, asterisk, asterisk. The room around him shifted. The walls stretched. The ceiling pulled away. Shapes melted into shadows. And then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. But not his own. "You should have never looked." Harris's vision blurred. His limbs wouldn't move. The shattered mirror lay in pieces around him. And his reflection stood over him. No longer trapped in the glass. It tilted its head. Slow. Calculated. Joel's grin stretched across its lips. It crouched down, inches from Harris's face. And whispered, "Now I get to wear you." A freezing hand pressed against his chest. Harris's eyes widened in terror. A force, heavy and suffocating, pushed down. Like something was peeling him away from himself. Like something was taking his place. His vision darkened. His heartbeat slowed. And as his body went still, his reflection stood up, straightened its jacket, flexed its fingers, and exhaled. The breath was different now. Steady. Controlled. It turned toward the one-way mirror, where the real Harris should have been. Only now, Harris wasn't anywhere at all. The thing wearing his face smiled, rolled its shoulders, and walked toward the door. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Detective Harris, you okay in there?" The thing paused. Then, in Harris's voice, perfectly, effortlessly, it answered, "Yeah, I'm fine." And it walked out, leaving the real Harris trapped in the glass, watching, screaming, but unheard. Forever. The room was silent again. Still, except for the faint buzz of the broken light overhead. Harris could feel the cold, the suffocating emptiness around him. But he couldn't move. His body, still as stone, trapped in the shattered mirror. He was a reflection, a ghost, trapped in a cage of glass and shadows. The echo of his own voice, asterisk, asterisk, his own laughter, asterisk, asterisk, lingered in the air, but it was distant, drowned out by the soft hum of the intercom. The door creaked open. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed in the hallway outside. The thing wearing his face walked out, carrying his name, his life, his soul. It passed through the door, and Harris was left alone, frozen, imprisoned within the reflection, a prisoner to the one thing he couldn't escape, the mirror. For as long as he could see, there was nothing but the cold, oppressive silence. He tried to scream, but there was no sound. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him, the faintest flicker of light, a shadow that wasn't his own, and a final whisper so soft, so distant, "You'll never leave." The glass cracked once more, and everything went silent. Forever, there was no sound, no light, just the endless, consuming darkness that wrapped itself around Harris like a shroud. His mind raced, desperate to hold on to the fragments of his own existence. But every memory, every thought, felt more distant, more fractured. He couldn't tell if he was still in the room, still in that interrogation space, or if he was somewhere else entirely now. The reflection, the thing that wore his face, asterisk, asterisk, was free, asterisk, asterisk. But Harris was no longer himself. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him, an endless, suffocating pressure, a pull, dragging him deeper into the abyss. But just as he thought he might slip away completely, a cold, sharp feeling pierced through the void. A flash, a brief moment of light, a moment of clarity. It was the face again, not Joel's face, not his own, but something else, something twisted and wrong, a reflection within a reflection. And for the briefest second, Harris saw a door, a way out. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He reached for it, stretching, desperate. But as his fingers brushed the edge of the door, it slammed shut. The room swallowed him whole again. Darkness, cold, and a voice. "You're mine now." The voice was calm, no longer amused. It was final. And the last thing Harris heard, the last thing he felt, was the echo of his own scream, trapped forever in the reflection. The darkness never let go. The darkness stretched on, infinite and suffocating. Time had no meaning here, no beginning, no end. Harris's thoughts became fragmented, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Every attempt to hold on to his sense of self felt weaker, more distant. The coldness grew heavier. It wasn't just around him anymore. It was within him. His body, now something foreign, felt as though it were fading, dissolving into the very fabric of the void. And yet, in the silence, the reflection still lingered. That distorted version of himself. Asterisk, asterisk, the thing that wore his face, asterisk, asterisk, was never far. He could feel its presence in the background of his mind, a cold shadow always just out of reach. No matter how hard he tried to escape, to scream, to fight, it followed. It was always there. Harris didn't know how long it had been since that moment when the door slammed shut. But in that time, something had changed. His surroundings began to twist, contorting into shapes that made no sense. Dark figures moved in the periphery, just beyond his sight. He couldn't make them out, but they were there lurking, watching. The voice was still there too. "You can't run from me." The words weren't spoken aloud. They were felt, crawling under his skin, echoing inside his mind, pulsing with an unholy rhythm. It was all-consuming, overwhelming, but Harris still tried. With every ounce of strength, he tried to move, to break free from whatever this nightmare was. Then, for a fleeting moment, he saw a shape, a figure, not a reflection, not his own distorted face. A new face, a face of someone he recognized, but couldn't quite place. The figure hovered at the edge of his vision, not moving, just watching, waiting. Harris reached out, but as his hand extended toward it, it vanished, and the darkness swallowed him whole again. There was no escape, and the last thing he heard, "You're not alone anymore." And then, the world went silent once more. The silence was unbearable, like the weight of eternity pressing down on him. Harris's breath was shallow, quick. Each inhale felt strained. Asterisk, asterisk, unnatural, asterisk, asterisk. The darkness closed in around him, suffocating. But something was different now. Something had shifted. He could feel it, the subtle change in the air. A presence. Asterisk, asterisk, familiar, asterisk, asterisk, but distant, lingered just beyond his reach. The figures in the shadows were no longer just watching. They were moving closer, slowly, but they made no sound. Not a footstep, not a breath, only the faintest brush of air, like the whisper of fabric. The figures were circling him. He could sense them now, more clearly than before. But every time he tried to focus on one, they melted back into the void, like shadows cast by a flickering flame. Uncatchable. Harris could feel his mind fracturing. It was as if the darkness itself were pulling him apart, bit by bit. His thoughts, once his own, now felt foreign, distorted. The voice, asterisk, asterisk, that voice, asterisk, asterisk, was growing louder, but not in the way it had before. It was now inside him, a buzzing hum that rattled his bones. "You belong to me now." The words scraped across his mind like 1,000 needles. He wanted to scream, to break free from it, but his voice, his very will, felt distant. Gone, just like the figure that had appeared before him. Gone. And then a sound, a ripple, the tiniest crack of light. For the first time in what felt like forever, something shifted. The figures moved back, retreating into the shadows. A break, a flicker. Harris reached. He reached for it, for that brief moment of light, the crack in the darkness. And as his hand neared it, a sharp pull yanked him forward. He didn't know what it was, where it had come from, but it was there, a force gripping him, stronger than any fear, stronger than the voice. It dragged him through the darkness, past the whispers, past the cold figures that had once circled him. He was moving, he was leaving, and the last thing he felt, before everything collapsed, was the faintest pulse of warmth against his skin. A single, flickering light that seemed to promise something he hadn't felt in so long. Hope. Harris didn't look back. He stepped into the hallway, the weight of the door behind him closing with a soft thud, as if sealing something away. His footsteps echoed, steady and firm, but the sound fell off. Asterisk, asterisk, distant, asterisk, asterisk. The air outside the interrogation room felt almost too real, like stepping back into a world he no longer recognized. He glanced at the walls, clean, empty. The sterile hallway stretched out in front of him, familiar, yet alien. The feeling in his chest, that subtle unease, hadn't left. The darkness wasn't gone. It was still there, lingering at the edges of his perception, like something just out of sight. As Harris moved down the corridor, his steps slowed. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. That presence, that shadow, still clung to him. A whisper brushed the edges of his thoughts, soft and unrelenting. "I'm still here." He stopped. The hallway stretched on before him, but now it felt different. The walls seemed to pulse, the light overhead flickering like a faulty bulb. A cold draft swept through, sending a shiver down his spine. Harris turned. Behind him, the interrogation room door had opened again. He could feel it, the pull, the undeniable force that seemed to call him back. He took a step forward, but his body froze. Something inside him, some part of him that had been changed by the darkness, refused to let him turn back. A voice echoed, asterisk, asterisk, his own voice, asterisk, asterisk. You can never truly leave. The whisper curled around him, like fingers wrapping around his mind. The room. The mirror. The thing that had once worn his face. It was all part of him now. Harris took a slow breath. He was no longer just Harris. He was something else. Something changed. And as the hallway stretched on before him, he knew there was no escape, only the inevitable return. To the reflection, to the darkness, and to whatever awaited him next. Harris stood there in the dim hallway, every inch of him on edge, as though the very walls were watching. He could feel the air growing thicker, a weight pressing down on him that made it hard to breathe. The whisper was still there, crawling inside his thoughts, slipping through his mind like fingers through water. You're mine now. The words echoed like a distant memory, a part of him he couldn't escape. He glanced back at the open door to the interrogation room. The flickering light above seemed to beckon, almost like it was calling him home, pulling him back to the place where everything had twisted, where his reality had fractured. The shadows cast by the broken glass seemed to dance and swirl at the edges of his vision, as though mocking him, reminding him of the mirror that had once held his soul captive. But Harris didn't want to go back. He couldn't. He'd tasted freedom, even if it was fleeting, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. He forced his feet to move, pushing forward, away from the room, away from the echoing whispers. He took each step with the urgency of someone who knew that if he stopped, even for a second, he would be swallowed whole again. But the hall stretched on endlessly, impossibly long. The walls seemed to close in around him, warping and bending, distorting the world around him. The floors beneath him groaned with every step, as if the very foundation of this place were crumbling beneath him. And then, a sudden stillness. Everything stopped. The air grew deathly quiet. The lights flickered one last time, and then went out. Complete darkness surrounded him. He reached out in the pitch black, his hand grasping for something, anything. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow, ragged. You can't run from me. The voice came again, louder this time, as if it was right beside him. He spun around, but there was nothing, just an endless void, swallowing him up. A cold hand gripped his shoulder. Harris froze, his body locking in place as his skin crawled with the undeniable sensation that he wasn't alone. And just before the darkness engulfed him completely, one final thought pierced his mind. He hadn't escaped. He'd never truly left. The reflection was always there, waiting. The light grew stronger, a beacon in the vast, empty dark. Harris could feel it, warming him, pulling him towards something, asterisk, asterisk, something real, asterisk, asterisk. As he was drawn closer, the darkness began to recede. The oppressive weight that had held him down for so long started to lift, like the world was being pulled away from his shoulders. With each step, the shadows around him flickered and faded, dissolving into nothing. Harris's heart beat faster now, no longer a distant echo, but something living, steady, asterisk, asterisk, alive, asterisk, asterisk. And then, he stepped into the light. It was blinding, but it was a relief. The darkness, the weight, the voice, all of it was gone. For the first time in what felt like eternity, he could breathe. Harris opened his eyes. The interrogation room. It was exactly how he remembered it. The cold, sterile walls, the single light hanging overhead. But something was different. There was no glass, no mirror, no reflection. Just him. Harris stood, disoriented but grounded. His body felt solid again. He felt whole. But there was something else, something deep inside him that was now aware. The silence was unsettling in its finality. He was free, but freedom came with a price. Harris felt it, like a subtle whisper in the back of his mind, lingering just beneath the surface. A shadow that wasn't his own, still watching. The reflection was gone, but the darkness was still there, and it would always be a part of him. He could feel it, Harris took a deep breath and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. As he reached for the handle, the softest click echoed in the room. The door swung open, and Harris stepped out, into the world, not as the man he once was, but as someone else. Someone changed, and in the distance, far beyond the door, there was a whisper, a faint chuckle. "I'll be seeing you again, Harris." And this time he didn't look back.